I used to think the biggest shock of my life was the night I discovered my husband was cheating on me, until that morning, when a man I had never worked closely with, never shared a real conversation with, and who had never even offered a polite hello, looked at me like I was an old chair in the corner of the room and calmly said, "I need you in my office, right now. No explanation, no empathy." And he had no idea that his hasty decision to fire me would be the very thing that triggered his own downfall. It was 8:37 a.m. I was standing by the familiar coffee machine on the 12th floor of Arken Vale's headquarters, one of the biggest financial advisory firms in the Northeast, located right in the heart of downtown Winsfield. As usual, I added a splash of almond milk to my hot black coffee, took a sip, trying to soothe the headache still lingering from last night's late meeting. Then the break room door swung open, and in walked Arken Vale, the man who had become CEO less than 48 hours earlier, and also the only son of the company's founder. He didn't greet me. He didn't smile. He just stood there, tailored gray suit, pressed to perfection, eyes cold, as if he was staring through me, not at me. And then, like he was following some pre-programmed script, he issued his first decree of this new regime. "Amira, I need you in my office, now." I froze, not because of the words themselves, but the way they were delivered with authority, indifference, and no room for rebuttal. I set my coffee down, a cold warning blooming in my chest, the kind that had never been wrong before. 11 years of service, hundreds of contracts successfully negotiated, a client services department I built from scratch. It all suddenly meant nothing as I followed him down a sterile hallway, straight to the office where just yesterday I'd presented our Middle East expansion strategy. Kieran didn't offer me a seat. He stood behind his desk, not looking up, flipping through pages as if choosing a dessert. Then, with no lead-in, no expression, not even a pause for impact, he said, "You're fired, effective immediately." I don't remember how long the silence lasted. My heart was pounding, ears ringing, body frozen. I thought I'd cry, or scream, or demand an explanation. But instead, I did the one thing he didn't expect. I smiled. A calm, measured, unshaken smile. "Understood. Have a nice day, Mr. Vale." I walked out with my head held high, but deep in my chest, the waves of fury and heartbreak were just beginning to rise. My coworkers glanced up as I passed, some standing, concern in their eyes, but I stopped them with a subtle shake of the head. Don't make this any harder." I boxed up my belongings in silence, and as I drove out of the underground parking lot, one question burned in my mind. Why? Why would someone who had never worked with me, never seen what I actually did, so casually erase me from a company I'd given everything to? But what I didn't know was that his impulsive decision had just dug the first hole of his own grave. And I would be the one watching, as everything he built came crashing down. If you think the story ends here, you're mistaken. This is just the beginning of a power game, one that would cost reputations, multi-million-dollar contracts, and unearth secrets no one expected. Keep watching to find out how the woman pushed aside became the one who took control of the board. As I drove away from Arken Vale that morning, the same building where I had spent over a decade shaping a career I thought would never betray me, the silence inside the car pressed against me, like a weight I couldn't shake. Off. The hum of the engine faded beneath the roar of memory, and it wasn't long before my mind was consumed by scenes I hadn't allowed myself to revisit in years, not because I'd forgotten them, but because I had buried them too deep to face, while life demanded I keep moving forward. I had joined the firm when it was nothing more than a promising name in an oversaturated market, when the office space barely had functional plumbing and everyone had to take turns making coffee. Back then, the company was still run by Jonathan Vale, Kieran's father, a man who didn't care where you came from as long as you showed up with grit, clarity, and the willingness to stay late until the job was done right. He had hired me after one interview, no frills, no tests, just a 20-minute conversation and a handshake that carried more weight than any contract I would sign after. In those early years, I poured everything I had into my work, Not because I wanted recognition, but because I believed in what we were building. I stayed after hours until the cleaning crew asked if I was sleeping there. I volunteered for projects no one wanted, managed clients that others were too nervous to handle, and when a client threatened to walk because of a single misstep by another department, I was the one who turned the conversation around and closed the deal with nothing but a phone call and my word. It was during those years that the client services division began to take shape, not from some boardroom directive or executive vision, but from the countless hours I spent crafting policies, designing workflows, training junior reps, and fighting for the trust of clients who had no reason to believe in us yet. I negotiated contracts worth millions without ever once losing my composure, even when I was pushed to the edge, even when my personal life was quietly crumbling behind the office smile. I never let slip. Because what Kieran didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that this company had been more than just a job to me. It had been my refuge. During the year, my marriage fell apart, and I found myself sitting alone in an empty apartment, pretending to be fine in front of clients while barely holding it together between meetings. It was this desk, this department, these walls that had given me something to hold on to. I took work calls while sitting in my parked car outside divorce mediation. I signed documents between tears I never allowed to fall where anyone could see. I missed birthdays, family holidays, and nights out with the few friends I had left, all because I believed naively maybe that dedication would be enough to secure my place here. But loyalty doesn't matter to someone like Arken Vale. Legacy does. Power does. Optics. And the moment he stepped into that office, with his custom-tailored arrogance and nameplate he didn't earn, he didn't see me as the foundation beneath the firm's biggest accounts. He saw me as obsolete, disposable, a holdover from a past he never respected. And yet, what gnawed at me most wasn't the dismissal itself, it was the timing, the precision. We were days away from finalizing the Kingswell contract, a deal I had nurtured for over 6 months, built from whispers and connections, cultivated with cultural fluency, long calls across time zones, and in-person meetings that stretched late into the night. I knew their CEO's hesitation points, their legal team's preferences, even the style of communication their head of finance preferred. The final review meeting was scheduled for Friday, and yet, with no warning, I was removed like a pawn swept from a board by a player who hadn't even learned the rules. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the minutes bled into hours, replaying every interaction with Kieran from the moment he walked through the office doors. His disinterest, his avoidance, the way he'd smirk during presentations as if he already knew better. I had thought it was just immaturity. Now I knew it was something far more dangerous: entitlement, wrapped in ignorance, wielding power like a sword he didn't know how to use. And something didn't add up. Why would he fire me right before the most critical negotiation in the firm's recent history? Had he even looked at the Kingswell documentation? Did he even know the terms I'd built into that contract, including the clause I had insisted be inserted after the Caldwell acquisition disaster 2 years ago? A clause that made me, and only me, the legally authorized negotiator for Kingswell. I hadn't thought about that clause in months. It had been added after a rushed acquisition fell apart due to miscommunication and had cost the firm a fortune in penalties and lost reputation. I had pushed hard for stronger protections, and Jonathan Vale, the real CEO, the man who had once called me the spine of the client division, had backed me. Without my signature, without my presence, Kingswell couldn't legally proceed. Not with anyone, not even the CEO's son. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Until then, I had been dazed, heartbroken, humiliated, confused. But now, beneath the grief, another sensation stirred: clarity. The realization that he had fired me without understanding the one piece of paper that now held more power than his title. And in doing so, he hadn't just betrayed me, he had sabotaged himself. The damage was already done, but the fallout was just beginning. The next morning, just after 9:00 a.m., as I sat at my kitchen table staring into a now cold cup of coffee, I couldn't bring myself to drink. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once, twice, My thumb hovered over the reject button. My nerves already frayed from a sleepless night, spent unraveling everything that had happened, and still not understanding why. But something told me to let it play out. So I picked up. "Amira," the voice said, deep, graveled, unmistakably familiar. "It's Jonathan Vale." For a second, my body locked in place. Hearing his voice again, the man who had once championed my work, who had trusted me when I was still just a hungry junior associate with more ambition than experience, sent a jolt down my spine. He didn't sound angry, not at first, just confused, alarmed. "I just walked into the office," he continued, and I could already hear the tension rising in his breath. "Why the hell did you pack up your things? What happened?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to say it, not because I was afraid, but because saying it out loud would make it real, and some part of me was still holding out hope that this had been a nightmare I could wake from. "Your son fired me," I said, each word heavy like a stone dropped into still water. "Yesterday morning. He said I was lazy, that I wasn't needed anymore." There was a long silence, so weighted that even the birds outside my window seemed to stop. Then a sharp inhale, the kind people take right before they lose their temper but don't want the person on the other end to hear it. "Amira," he said slowly, deliberately. Did Kieran read your contract?" I frowned, confused at the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" "He's scheduled to finalize the Kingswell deal today, isn't he?" His voice was getting faster now, more clipped, panic starting to seep through the cracks. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "The final review was set for 11. I spent 6 months prepping for that meeting." The line went quiet again, and then papers shuffling violently, followed by a loud thud, like something being slammed against a desk. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, as if the pieces had just fallen into place. "Amira, you're not just the lead on that deal. You're the only authorized negotiator." That clause, I had it written in myself after the Caldwell fiasco. It's not a suggestion, it's binding. Without you, we can't close it. Not legally, not with any credibility. His words sank into me slowly, like warm water soaking into cold stone. I knew that clause existed. I had fought for it. But in the haze of betrayal and confusion, I had forgotten just how much leverage I still had. Kieran had fired me without even reading the contract. He hadn't just made a cruel, impulsive move, he had effectively sabotaged the biggest deal his company had been chasing for over half a year. And in doing so, he hadn't just thrown away an employee. He had dismantled a relationship I had spent months cultivating with care and strategy. Something shifted inside me in that moment. The sting of humiliation was still there, but it had begun to cool, crystallizing into something sharper: clarity, control. Because while Kieran thought he had ended something, what he'd really done was pull the trigger on a gun he hadn't bothered to aim, and now the bullet was circling back toward him. Jonathan hung up without another word, but I could feel the fury radiating through the silence that followed. He knew, and worse, he knew this wasn't just about paperwork. It was about leadership, about carelessness, about a son who had confused inheritance with competence and power with authority. I remained motionless on the couch, staring at nothing, letting the weight of the situation settle around me like dust in a sunlit room. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been yesterday. I was resolved. At 10:13 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Kieran. I didn't answer. A minute later, another call came through. Then another reception. Legal. Accounting. My screen lit up like a warning beacon, voicemail icons blinking like alarms. But I stayed still, because for once, silence wasn't weakness. It was power. Eventually, I tapped open the first voicemail. His voice, usually so calculated and smug, now sounded strained, thinner, unsure. "Amira, hi, look, I think there was a misunderstanding yesterday. I might have acted too fast. We need you back today. It's urgent. Please call me." He didn't say he was sorry, not once, not even with the usual corporate polish. Just urgency, desperation dressed up as professionalism. I took a sip of my now ice-cold coffee, still didn't move, and when the next message came through at 10:32, this time from a number I hadn't seen in years, I finally picked up. "Amira," a voice whispered, "you won't believe what's happening here." It was Nicole, once a member of my team, before transferring to marketing. We hadn't spoken in months, but there was still warmth in her voice, though now it was buried beneath shock. "Kieran just got ripped apart by his dad. Like, in front of the entire meeting room. It was brutal." My heart didn't leap. It didn't ache. It simply waited. "Jonathan walked in with the Kingswell contract and slammed it on the table," she continued. "He asked one question. 'Did you read this before firing Amira?' And Kieran tried to deflect, said something vague about restructuring and new direction. But Jonathan wasn't buying it. He flipped straight to the clause you always used to talk about, the one that made you the sole negotiator." I could hear the background murmurs of the office behind her, whispers, footsteps, tension that seemed to travel through the phone line. Kieran went pale, she said, voice lower now, like truly pale, because he realized he was the reason the Kingswell deal was falling apart. I exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from the quiet satisfaction of watching the first crack appear in the image of a man who thought he was untouchable. "What did Jonathan say?" I asked. "He told him that if the deal collapses," Nicole said, pausing slightly, "then Kieran's position at Arken Vale becomes subject to reevaluation." I thanked her, softly, then ended the call, and as I stood, the tremble that had haunted my hands the day before was gone. Because this wasn't just a mistake. It was a miscalculation. And now, the game had changed. I didn't have to wait long. By 10:13 a.m., my phone began buzzing again. Same number, same name on the screen, Kieran Vale. I watched it light up from across the table where I sat, still in my robe, still in the same position I had been for the past hour, unmoving, as if motion itself might signal surrender. I let it ring out. No voicemail left this time. A few seconds later, another call came in, this one from the front desk, then from legal, then from someone in accounting whose name I barely remembered but who had once emailed me for clarification on an international wire transfer. My phone was pulsing like a beacon, relentless, flickering like static before a storm, but I didn't answer. Not yet. There is something powerful in silence, a kind of still defiance that doesn't scream but instead echoes in the panic of those who suddenly realize they've lost control. Finally, one voicemail notification appeared, blinking patiently, as if begging to be heard. I tapped it open, knowing what was coming, but still curious how he would spin it. "Amira." "Hey," Kieran's voice crackled through, forced casualness barely masking the anxiety beneath. "Listen, I think there was a misunderstanding yesterday. I may have acted too fast, and I realize now that, well, we really need you back. Today, it's urgent. Urgent. Not sorry. Not even cloaked in the formal platitudes of a standard HR apology. No ownership. No remorse. Just panic dressed in polished vowels." I didn't respond. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee, still cold, the bitterness grounding me in a moment I had spent years preparing for without even realizing it. And as I watched the morning light inch slowly across the hardwood floor of my apartment, I thought about all the nights I had stayed late, the weekends I had skipped, the compromises I had made to keep things afloat, and how in one careless move, Kieran had nearly burned it all down. Only now did he seem to understand that some positions can't be filled just by sliding a new name onto a door. At 10:32, another call came in this time, from a number I hadn't saved in years, but I recognized it instantly. Nicole, a former teammate, once one of my brightest mentees, now quietly working in marketing, far from the politics but never far from the pulse. I answered on the second ring. "Amira," she whispered, the sound of hushed urgency pouring through the line like steam from a pressure valve. "You're not going to believe what just happened." "Try me," I said, leaning back into the cushions, already knowing she wasn't calling to chat. Kieran just got obliterated by his father in front of everyone. Like everyone. The entire senior team. It was brutal. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining the boardroom long table, glass walls, the same space where I had once delivered strategy decks, under impossible deadlines and unreasonable expectations. I imagined Jonathan Vale standing at the head of the room, sleeves rolled slightly at the cuffs, face lined with fury, a quiet kind of anger, the kind that doesn't need to yell to shake the ground beneath your feet. He stormed into the meeting, Nicole continued, carrying the Kingswell contract in one hand and something that looked like a legal memo in the other, slammed them both onto the table. Everyone jumped. And then? I asked, though I already felt the answer rising in my chest like a tide. He asked one question. Just one. Nicole's voice dropped lower. Did you even read this before you fired her? I stayed quiet, letting her fill the space. Kieran tried to bluff, said something vague about restructuring, how he was aligning resources, evaluating talent. Total BS. But Jonathan wasn't buying it. He flipped to that clause, the clause. Amira. The one you had written in. The one no one else ever cared about but you kept insisting was necessary. I remember, I murmured, my voice barely audible, like I was talking to a younger version of myself. The one who had stayed up until 3 a.m., rereading every line of that contract, knowing deep down it might someday save me from something I couldn't yet name. Everyone in that room saw it, Nicole said. He read it aloud. The part that says you, and only you, are authorized to lead, present, and close negotiations with Kingswell. That clause was airtight. And Kieran, God, Amira. He looked like he'd been sucker-punched. I could almost see it, his face draining of color, his posture stiffening as the realization set in, not just that he had made a mistake, but that it was irrevocable and entirely his. What did Jonathan say after that? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Nicole paused, as if to let the weight of the next words land properly. He said if the deal falls through, Kieran's position becomes subject to review. There it was, the beginning of the unraveling. A threat in corporate terms, but anyone who had worked in that company long enough knew what subject to review really meant. It meant his time was running out. It meant the knives were out, and this time pointed in his direction. I don't know what you're planning, Nicole added gently, but whatever it is, you have the upper hand now. He knows it. I thanked her quietly and ended the call, then stood for the first time all morning and walked to the window. The city stretched out before me, glass towers, yellow cabs, office lights blinking like signals in the fog of human ambition. I always found comfort in that view. It reminded me that no matter how personal the chaos felt, the world kept moving, and so would I. But this time, I wouldn't be walking back in as an employee hoping for approval or a seat at the table. I'd be returning as the one person Kieran Vale couldn't erase, because I had built the very thing he was now begging me to save. It was just past noon when I arrived at the Arken Vale headquarters, the building I had entered every weekday for the past 11 years, always through the side entrance, always blending in with the rhythm of those too busy to notice. But this time, I didn't take the employee corridor or swipe my old badge past security. Instead, I stepped through the front lobby as a guest, deliberate, composed, and dressed in the kind of understated authority that didn't ask for attention, but demanded it. The lobby, usually humming with quiet conversation and the clack of polished shoes against marble, fell into a subtle hush the moment I crossed the threshold. The receptionist looked up from her screen, blinked, then stood not from protocol, but from the undeniable awareness that something was shifting. "Miss Hale," she stammered, eyes wide with recognition. "Mr. Vale is expecting you. Right this way." I nodded, offered no small talk, and followed her down the corridor. Each step echoed with quiet tension, not from my heels, but from the silence of those who saw me pass and remembered that, just 24 hours earlier, they had watched me leave with a box in my hands, and no explanation. Now those same eyes followed me with a different weight, not pity, not concern, but the realization that whatever was unfolding, it was bigger than any memo or staff-wide email could contain. As we approached the executive wing, the double glass doors parted, and there he stood, Jonathan Vale, not behind his desk or seated in his chair of power. but waiting at the door like a man who knew what it meant to take responsibility. He wasn't smiling. His expression was neutral, respectful, and tinged with something that felt dangerously close to regret. "Amira," he said, voice low, steady. "Thank you for coming." I met his gaze, gave him a nod, but didn't offer my hand. This wasn't a reunion. It was a reckoning. He stepped aside without a word and let me pass into the office, the one that used to be filled with plans, projections, and visions of expansion that I had spent months building from the ground up. Inside, everything was still. I took a seat across from the massive oak desk without being asked. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, exhaling like a man who had spent the entire morning holding his breath. "I made a mistake," he began, not with bluster or justification, but with quiet clarity. "A big one. I gave my son too much authority, too fast. I wanted him to find his footing, to prove himself, but I never imagined his first move would be to burn the very bridge that carried this company through its hardest years." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was finally confronting the cost of looking away for too long. "What he did to you wasn't just unprofessional," he continued, his voice tightening. "It was reckless, disrespectful, and it put a deal we've been chasing for over half a year at serious risk." I nodded slowly. "Yes, it did. I reviewed the Kingswell contract again this morning," he said, walking behind his desk and placing a copy of the document in front of me, already open to the page that mattered. Every word, every clause. "The language is ironclad. You have full autonomy, not just in name, but in legal standing. They won't accept anyone else at the table. Not now, not after all the work you've done." His voice softened. "You were right to fight for that clause, Amira. I should have seen it sooner." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sobering, the kind of pause that settles between people when truth finally finds air to breathe. "You didn't deserve what happened," he said, "and I'd like to offer you your role back with full authority to close the Kingswell deal. And whatever conditions you set, we'll honor them, no questions asked." I studied his face, not out of doubt, but to measure the sincerity of a man used to negotiations, someone who knew the weight of promises made behind closed doors. "I'll return," I said, my voice calm but firm, "but everything goes in writing revised terms, clear autonomy, and no interference from Kiran. Not now, not after this." He nodded without hesitation. "Done. And one more thing," I added, holding his gaze without flinching. "This can't happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone." He didn't argue. Instead, he sat back slowly, then gave a thoughtful nod, the kind a leader gives not because he has the answers, but because he's finally willing to listen. "You have my word." With that, I stood. The deal hadn't been sealed yet, but the dynamic had shifted, and I wasn't coming back to reclaim what was mine. I was coming to prove that no one would ever erase me again. As I stepped out of his office, I saw Kiran down the hallway, his arms crossed, pretending to chat with a junior associate who looked visibly uncomfortable. But the moment he saw me, his eyes snapped to mine. He didn't speak, didn't move, and neither did I. I simply walked past him without pause, without breaking stride, without offering so much as a glance over my shoulder. Because I didn't need to. The moment he saw me standing there, walking back into the place he had tried to exile me from, he realized the balance had shifted. Not just in titles, not just in meetings, but in the unspoken language of power, the kind that doesn't come from status, but from resilience earned in silence. And as I reached the boardroom where the Kingswell team was set to arrive, I didn't feel vindicated or angry. I felt ready. Because I wasn't just returning with my name. I was returning with every ounce of leverage he didn't know I had built. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone forget it. By the time the boardroom was fully prepared, the digital clock on the far wall had just turned 1:00 p.m. Everything was in place. The final term sheets had been printed in both English and Arabic. The coffee was fresh, the lighting soft but direct, and the long walnut table had been cleared of all distractions except the documents that would soon determine the fate of a deal worth more than just numbers on a ledger. It would mark a turning point in reputation, trust, and legacy, not just for Arken Vale, but for me. I took a moment to adjust the placement of the chairs, not because I needed to, but because the small rituals helped center my thoughts. The tension that had gripped me for the past 2 days had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something sharper, not anxiety, but focus. Every clause in that agreement had been tailored over months of conversations, late-night calls, across time zones, cultural nuances, and small, deliberate gestures that built a bridge between our firm and the Kingswell delegation. Their CEO, Mr. Samir Al-Fayed, was a man of precision and conviction, someone who valued mutual respect more than charm, and who, above all, had no patience for internal disarray. I had known from our earliest talks that the slightest hint of instability on our end would be a deal-breaker, which was why I had made it a personal mission to ensure every phase of this process reflected consistency and trust. Outside the boardroom, through the glass wall, I could see Kieran pacing like a trapped animal. His movements were sharp and erratic, and though he tried to look composed while speaking to a junior executive, one who barely made eye contact, his body betrayed him. His tie had been loosened, his jaw clenched, and he kept stealing glances toward the door, like someone waiting for a verdict they already feared. Moments later, Jonathan stepped into the hallway. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence shifted the air. Their conversation, though muffled through the thick glass, escalated quickly. Gestures grew sharper. Kieran's face turned a deep crimson, and at one point, Jonathan raised his hand with calm authority and stopped him mid-sentence. There was no yelling, just a father delivering a final, unspoken sentence. When Kieran turned and saw me watching, our eyes met, and for the first time since this began, his defiance wavered. There was no smugness left, only the dawning realization that nothing he did now could reverse the damage. At exactly 1:30 p.m., the Kingswell delegation arrived. Mr. Al-Fayed walked in flanked by 2 of his senior advisors, both sharp-eyed and impeccably dressed. As I stepped forward to greet them, I did so in fluent Arabic, not out of performance, but out of the same respect I had shown since the first meeting. The warmth in his eyes was immediate, his handshake firm. "You remembered," he said, a rare smile lifting the edges of his serious expression. "Respect builds partnerships," I replied with quiet conviction, "and this one was built to last." We sat, and for the next 2 hours, the meeting unfolded with measured confidence. Every question they raised had already been anticipated. Every concern had been addressed in the contract drafts. The language was tight, the deliverables clear, and the contingencies sound. Not once did Mr. Al-Fayed glance toward Jonathan or ask for confirmation from anyone else in the room. He looked at me, always at me, because he knew who had carried this from concept to close. And when the final signature hit the page, there was no applause, no dramatic declarations. Just the quiet sound of pen on paper, final, unshakable, followed by a handshake that sealed months of effort into one defining moment. After the Kingswell team left, their expressions calm and satisfied, Jonathan walked into the boardroom. His shoulders sagged, but this time it wasn't from defeat, it was from relief. He approached slowly, with none of the distance or guardedness from before. "You saved us," he said, voice low and full of something heavier than gratitude. "And I owe you more than just an apology." I met his eyes, not with resentment, but with resolve. "You owe your company a leader," I replied, each word deliberate, "one who knows the difference between authority and responsibility." He didn't argue. As I left the room and made my way toward the elevators, the tension I had carried for 48 sleepless hours began to dissipate. I had walked back into a place that had discarded me without thought, and walked out with its most important deal in hand. But it wasn't just the contract I had reclaimed. It was my identity, my value, and the quiet dignity they had tried to strip from me. Yet even as I stepped into the elevator, I knew the story wasn't over. Men like Kieran didn't vanish after a single defeat. They waited, they adapted, and they retaliated when no one was looking. But now, I was looking, and I wasn't going anywhere. The Kingswell deal made headlines in nearly every trade publication within the week, praised as a strategic breakthrough in international negotiations, lauded for its cultural alignment and bespoke structure, and recognized as a triumph for Arken Vale's global expansion efforts. They didn't mention my name, not directly. The article credited executive leadership and cross-border innovation, but anyone who had worked in that building long enough knew who had carried that deal from idea to ink. Inside the firm, word spread faster than the official statement. Colleagues I hadn't heard from in years sent quiet messages, some short and respectful, others surprisingly heartfelt. A few were from associates I had mentored when they were fresh out of business school, now mid-level managers trying to survive the shifting tides. They said they admired how I had kept my head up, how I hadn't lashed out or burned bridges, how I had moved with grace even as the ground was shaking beneath me. And while I appreciated their words, I also knew better than to mistake validation for safety. The atmosphere at Arken Vale had changed, but only on the surface. There were smiles in the break room again. The interns dared to speak above a whisper. Jonathan Vale made it clear in several leadership meetings that his son was no longer involved in any high-level decisions until further notice, a phrase that hung in the air like smoke, neither comforting nor complete. Kieran was still in the building, still occupying his office, still playing the role, but his authority had been fractured, and fractures rarely stay hidden for long. At first, I thought the tension would simply fade, that after the storm, we would all return to the rhythm of contracts and client calls. But then, the small things began, subtle at first, almost dismissible if you weren't paying attention, and I always paid attention. My expense reports for the Kingswell meeting, submitted with receipts and detailed justifications, were delayed with no explanation. Follow-up emails went unanswered. When I finally received a response from accounting, it was cold and vague, citing a new review policy that no one could provide documentation for. Then came the unsigned documents. Materials I submitted for project approval returned with no feedback, just blank rejection stamps or digital silence. It became a pattern, though never frequent enough to raise alarms on its own, and always cloaked in procedural language that made it difficult to confront directly. The real blow came when our European partner emailed me personally to clarify numbers he had received from our internal system, numbers that were not only incorrect, but traced back to an email sent from my own address. The spreadsheet had been altered, key figures were changed, and it was forwarded without my consent. He reached out because we had history, because he trusted me, not the system, and he sensed something was off. I reported it immediately to our internal systems team. They launched a review, checked for external breaches, ran security sweeps. The result came back within 2 days. No signs of phishing, no third-party interference. The activity had originated from inside the building, from a shared workstation near the main conference hall, using manually entered credentials. In other words, someone inside had accessed my login. And that was when the unease that had been quietly stirring in my chest hardened into something darker certainty. Kieran Vale hadn't finished what he started. He had simply changed tactics. He no longer had the power to remove me outright, not after the Kingswell success, not while Jonathan was still watching, but he could do something quieter, something insidious. He could undermine me from within, orchestrate small failures, subtle mistakes that would make others question my judgment, plant doubt in rooms I wasn't invited to. Until eventually the story shifted from "our hero saved the deal" to "maybe she got lucky." And I had seen this playbook before. Years ago, fresh out of university, I had worked under a senior partner who used charm in public and sabotage in private. He wouldn't confront his targets directly. Instead, he'd reroute resources without warning, quietly erase names from project rosters, and frame every misstep as coincidence. By the time his victims realized what was happening, they were too isolated to fight back. Most just left. Quiet exits, clean transitions, no drama, and no legacy. But I wasn't 22 anymore, and I wasn't going to disappear. So I began to document everything, every suspicious delay, every unsigned form, every incident where my access suddenly expired for no technical reason. I logged names, dates, and times in a private notebook I kept locked in my bag. I made digital backups and stored them in places only I could reach. I had learned the hard way that in places like this, emotion didn't win battles. Paper trails did. Then, one afternoon, as I passed by the smaller executive conference room, I heard my name not shouted, not whispered, but spoken with just enough volume to stop me cold. "She's unstable," Kieran was saying, his voice sharper than usual. "Ever since she came back, she's been erratic, aggressive. I don't think she's fit to manage high-pressure clients." There was a pause. A second voice replied, one I didn't recognize. "But the Kingswell deal." "She got lucky," Kieran cut in quickly. "We can't build a leadership pipeline on luck. She's overextended. She's not the right fit anymore." I didn't move, didn't react, just stood there in the hallway, heart pounding not from fear but from the realization that the campaign had already begun. He was planting seeds again. Not with evidence, but with implication. He knew he couldn't attack my record, so he would attack my character, shift the narrative, poison the well. That evening, I stayed late. The halls were mostly empty, lights dimmed, the sound of typing faint in distant corners. I sat alone in the glass-walled conference room, the city lights flickering beyond the windows, and stared at the folder of printed reports I had begun compiling not for revenge, but for protection. Because I knew what came next. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was war. The office had taken on a colder tone that week, not in temperature, but in the air between people, in the way conversations drifted into whispers when I walked by, in the glances that darted away too quickly or lingered too long. There were those who smiled, politely, trying not to pick a side, and those who avoided eye contact entirely, as if proximity to me might somehow implicate them in a battle they weren't brave enough to name. And though no one said it out loud, everyone knew something had shifted. The audit had begun. I hadn't requested it, but deep down, I was relieved Jonathan Vale had ordered the investigation himself. Something in his posture during our last conversation told me he had already seen enough to justify it, not just in missing emails or budget irregularities, but in the way the air around his son had grown increasingly toxic. Too many things had slipped through the cracks under Kieran's leadership, and cracks like that didn't form overnight. They widened slowly, fed by ego, denial, and unchecked ambition. The internal audit team set up shop in what used to be a storage room on the 6th floor, now transformed into a temporary war room. Files were stacked on every surface, monitors displayed system logs and access points, and the whiteboard lining the back wall was filled with timelines and login traces, forming a kind of forensic map of betrayal. When I was summoned to speak with the audit lead, David Hallstrom, I knew it wasn't a formality. I had prepared meticulously, not to defend myself, but to ensure every piece of the truth had context. I entered the room calmly, handed over my personal documentation, and sat across from David as he pulled up one of the flagged emails on the screen. "This email," he said, pointing at the message sent to our European partner, was traced to a shared workstation outside the break room. The credentials were manually entered. "So someone typed in my login," I said, keeping my voice steady, even as my pulse quickened. "Yes," he replied. "Copied credentials. Not phishing. Not an external breach. Internal." I folded my hands. I reported that incident the day it happened. He gave a tight nod, the kind people use when confirmation makes a hard truth unavoidable. "And we're glad you did, because it helped us connect the dots. We found others. Emails modified after being sent. Spreadsheets overwritten. Approvals removed. Every instance originated from shared machines, always involving your projects, and always under your name." A heaviness settled in my chest, not from shock, but from the weight of finally hearing out loud what I had known for weeks. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't coincidence. It was targeted, coordinated, deliberate. David hesitated for a moment, Then continued. We've also noticed irregular activity from a login tied to Kieran's executive assistant patterns that mirror the ones we've seen in your case. I didn't speak right away. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was deliberate, a pause to let the reality of what he'd just said sink into something more than numbers on a screen. So, what happens now? I asked, my voice composed but clear. That's where it gets complicated, he replied. Jonathan's requested a direct report, full transparency, no internal filters. I nodded slowly. Then I'll be there. David raised an eyebrow, surprised. You're not required. I know, I said, but I will be. Because if the truth was going to surface, then I wanted to look every person in that room in the eye, especially the one who had spent the last month trying to destroy me from the shadows. The night before the confrontation, I barely slept. My mind churned through everything I had collected. The notes, the timestamps, the silent witnesses who had chosen safety over support. I thought about the others who had left before me, quiet exits that made more sense now than they had at the time. People whose reputations had started to unravel just before they moved on, and I wondered how many of them had simply decided it wasn't worth fighting. But I had already fought too hard for my place, for my dignity, for a company I had once believed in enough to sacrifice parts of myself to build it. I arrived early to the executive boardroom the next morning. Jonathan was already there, standing near the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders stiff with anticipation. David and his team entered minutes later, followed by two senior partners whose expressions were unreadable. Then came Kieran 10 minutes late, phone in hand, wearing the kind of smile that had once passed for confidence but now read as desperation in disguise. The moment he stepped into the room and saw me seated at the table, his composure faltered. She's not part of the audit committee, he said, trying to keep his voice level. Jonathan didn't turn to face him. She's here at my request. Kieran shifted, clearly rattled. This is supposed to be internal, confidential. Then maybe you should have kept it that way, I said, calmly but firmly, instead of using company systems to manufacture emails in my name. Kieran scoffed, trying to recover. That's ridiculous. She's just bitter because she got let go. David cleared his throat and stepped forward. We've traced multiple incidents to a single login tied to your assistant's access credentials, all involving sabotage efforts aimed at Amira's work. The pattern is consistent. The timing lines up. There's no plausible deniability left. Kieran's expression changed. Not into anger, but into disbelief, the kind people wear when they realize their usual tricks no longer work, when the curtain has been pulled back and the audience is no longer applauding. You're reaching, he muttered. This is all circumstantial. No, I said, meeting his gaze directly. You're just used to getting away with it. Jonathan finally turned to face his son. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of finality. I gave you chances, Kieran. More than one. I wanted you to learn, to grow. But you've done nothing but dismantle what others built with their own hands, and worse, you did it with arrogance and cowardice. There was no reply, just silence, heavy, absolute. Jonathan stepped forward, holding a printed report in one hand. The board will review this in full, but until then, you are suspended. Effective immediately. Kieran opened his mouth to object, but the words never came. He looked at me one last time, not with rage, but with a kind of vacant confusion, as if he genuinely hadn't expected this ending, as if for the first time in his life, the rules had actually applied to him. He left the room without another word. I remained seated, my breathing steady, my hands unclenched. For the first time since this all began, I felt the weight begin to lift, not because I had won, but because the truth had finally spoken for itself. Jonathan sank into the chair across from me, eyes tired. I failed him, he said, more to himself than to me. As a leader, maybe even as a father. You can't lead someone who refuses to grow, I said quietly, but you can still lead this company. He looked at me and nodded. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, I had already taken back more than just my reputation. I had reclaimed my power. 2 weeks had passed since that final confrontation, but the echoes of that morning still lingered in the corners of every hallway, behind every polite smile, and in the hushed tones of break-room conversations. Arken Vale had not returned to the office, and his once confident stride through the executive floor had become nothing more than a memory no one dared speak of openly. His absence wasn't addressed in meetings, not formally, but the silence said more than any company-wide announcement ever could. The board had moved swiftly. The findings of the audit were clear, extensive, and most importantly, undeniable. The falsified communications, the unauthorized system activity, the trail of tampered documents, all pointed back to a web of manipulation, carefully crafted and orchestrated by a man who believed he was untouchable. There was no grand statement of dismissal, no dramatic press release. Just a quiet HR notice, a locked office, and a final internal memo citing breach of ethical conduct and compromised operational integrity. But no one needed details. The story had already told itself. In the weeks that followed, I found no satisfaction in the gossip that rippled through the building like static, no joy in the stories told in whispers, no vindication in the raised eyebrows or knowing nods. What I felt instead was calm, the kind that doesn't come from victory, but from having endured something that tried to erase you and choosing, instead, to stay. One afternoon, Jonathan called me into his office. He didn't stand behind his desk like he usually did. He was seated, quiet, thoughtful, a closed folder in front of him that he hadn't yet touched. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting," he began, his voice heavier than I'd ever heard it, "about the kind of leadership this company deserves, about what I allowed to happen, and who stood tall when everything around them began to collapse." He slid the folder toward me but didn't open it. "You've demonstrated more strength, clarity, and professionalism in the past month than most people show in an entire career. You protected our biggest client relationship under extreme pressure, defended yourself without stooping to the level of those who tried to tear you down, and held this company together when my own son tried to break it apart." Inside the folder was an offer, not just a return to my old position, but a promotion, Director of Client Strategy, an executive seat at the table, a direct report to Jonathan himself. The title came with privileges, but it wasn't the title that made me pause. It was the chance to reshape something from within, not just for myself, but for the people who would come after me. "I didn't ask for this," I said quietly, still processing what the offer meant. "I know," he replied. "That's why you deserve it." I closed the folder slowly, not out of uncertainty, but out of purpose. If I accept this, I want to be clear. I'm not here for optics. I don't want to just hold a title. I want the authority to rebuild the culture we lost, the one that valued quiet resilience over loud ambition, results over connections, and loyalty over legacy. His smile was tired, but real. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." That evening, as I walked alone into the temporary office they had assigned me while renovations began on the new executive wing, I paused for a moment in the doorway. There was no nameplate yet, no framed credentials or signs of ownership, just an empty desk, a silent room, and the weight of everything I had survived, pressing gently on my shoulders like a cloak I now wore with quiet pride. For years, I had worked tirelessly, without demanding recognition. I had taken midnight calls, diffused irate clients, redrafted proposals hours before major presentations, all in the belief that good work spoke for itself. But now I understood that silence, when used too long as a shield, can become a prison, and I had no intention of stepping back into that cell. The weeks that followed were filled with reconstruction, not of the office, but of the way we worked. I reinstated 2 employees who had been sidelined during Kieran's brief reign. I pushed for a blind evaluation process in promotions. I helped establish an anonymous reporting channel for ethics violations, not because I expected to use it, but because I wanted to ensure no one would ever feel as alone as I had felt when the sabotage began. And perhaps most importantly, I made myself available to the younger staff, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, those who had seen what I went through and didn't know whether strength or silence would serve them better. They asked me privately how I managed to stay composed, how I didn't explode or walk away. You don't always get to choose the battle, I told them gently, but you do get to decide who you become in the middle of it. As for Kieran, the last I heard, he was applying for positions out of state, smaller firms, less visibility. Word had already spread, quietly but thoroughly, and it seemed that wherever he went, the shadow of what he had done followed just behind him. Some said Jonathan had pulled a few strings to keep the fallout contained, not to protect his son, but to protect the firm. Maybe that was his last act of fatherhood. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. One afternoon, while walking past the now unused negotiation room where Kingswell had signed the deal, I paused. I stood at the glass, watching my own reflection against the backdrop of the city, a city that had never paused for my pain, had never bent for my victories, but had witnessed them all just the same. That single contract had altered the direction of my career, but it wasn't the signatures that changed me. It was the moment I stood in Arken Vale's office, smiled, and walked away, not in defeat, but in defiance. Because that was the turning point. Not when I came back, but when I refused to beg. The wind had shifted, not outside, but within the walls of Arken Vale, where, for the first time in years, the air felt light enough to breathe deeply without bracing for the next blow. The company was still standing, the skyline still stretched across my office window, and the hum of industry carried on. But something fundamental had changed, not in the way we processed numbers or signed contracts, but in the way people spoke, walked, and looked each other in the eye. Culture is invisible until it breaks. And mine had cracked, then mended, not in silence, but in confrontation. I didn't walk through the halls the same way I used to. There was no longer that quiet sense of proving that internal pressure to earn my place, to stay small enough to be safe but competent enough to be needed. Now, people paused when I passed, not out of fear or obligation, but because they knew what had happened, what had almost been lost, and who had stood when others stepped aside. I wasn't proud in the way people often use that word, not boastful or basking in recognition. It was something quieter, deeper. The kind of pride that sits next to pain and nods because it knows what it took to get here. But I didn't let that sense of resolution make me complacent. I knew how easily a system could slip back into comfort, how even well-intentioned people could allow familiar patterns to take root again if no one stayed vigilant. So I kept my promises to myself, to my team, to the people who had once been afraid to speak up. I rebuilt from the inside out. The performance review structure changed first, now blind, cross-evaluated, and rebalanced for equity rather than perception. The mentorship program that had once been performative was restructured into something real, with accountability, support, and a clear pathway for advancement that didn't require proximity to power. And I made space intentionally for those who had felt invisible, because I knew what it meant to be seen only when things were on fire. But the transformation wasn't just procedural, it was personal. I began to understand, truly, what I had almost let them take from me, not just my job, not just a deal, but the parts of myself that I had learned to dim for the sake of harmony. The professionalism I had once wielded like armor had become a cage, and it was only in the moment I was forced to walk away that I realized how much of myself I had hidden to survive. Strength isn't silence. It's choosing when to speak and refusing to let fear choose for you. And if there's anything I've learned from the collapse and rebuilding of my professional world, it's that people will underestimate the quiet ones until the moment they can't. Until the moment the one they dismissed walks into a boardroom and closes a deal no one else could. Until the woman they ignored rises from exile with a pen, a clause, and a name they now have no choice but to remember. Somewhere across the country, or maybe across the state, Arken Vale is still looking for a second chance. Some say he'll find it eventually. Maybe at a smaller firm, maybe under a different title, maybe behind a new facade. But wherever he goes, he'll carry with him the ghost of what happened here. Because legacies don't fade when they're erased, they fade when they're ignored. And mine was no longer something anyone could overlook. I don't need the applause. I don't need the spotlight. I don't even need the title, though I wear it now with quiet certainty. What I needed was to remember who I was before they tried to write me out of my own story. And now that I have, I'll never let that truth be questioned again. Because, in the end, the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's survival. It's return. And it's the simple, unshakable reminder that I was never just an employee, never just a department head, never just a negotiator with a folder full of numbers and a signature that mattered. I was and am the storm they didn't see coming. And I didn't win because I screamed the loudest. I won because when the chaos came for me, I didn't flinch. I stood. And when the fire cleared, I was still there holding the pen, writing the next chapter myself.